This is the first video for Hatshepsut, who is our historical personality, and this first one is more about the geography and history of Egypt leading up to the time of Hatshepsut. So in this section we're going to have a look at the geography of Egypt and how that is significant for the people of Egypt, and it had a lot of influence on the kings and the roles of the kings, as well as religion and other factors and building programs, etc. We'll have a look at the resources available to the Egyptians, how they got along with their neighbours, the 18th dynasty, which is the focus that we look at. We look at Hatshepsut was a queen and then a king in the 18th dynasty, and then we'll have a look at their social, military and economic structures at the time and some of their religious beliefs. So here's a map of Egypt, and I'm going to point out some of the significant aspects about it. So this is Africa. We've got the Mediterranean Sea up here, and this is where the Nile River drains into the sea, and this is called the Nile Delta. A delta, the Egyptians likened it to a lotus flower because of the way it sort of blossomed into like a flower at the end there. What it means is you've got this main river that divides up into little tributaries and flows out to the sea via them. So it just divides up into lots of smaller rivers and streams leading out to the sea. What we need to understand is that Egypt is a desert, and I'm going to talk about that in the next couple of slides as well. But that Nile River was really the only source of life for the Egyptians. It was the most significant to their survival. What we have with Egypt is we have Upper and Lower Egypt. That's how we kind of break it up. But Upper Egypt is actually not where you'd expect. You'd think Upper Egypt would be north, but Upper Egypt is actually to the south. So this is Upper Egypt down here, down towards here, and this is Lower Egypt to the north. And over time, the Egyptians, we have three kingdoms in Egypt. We have the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. And the period we're looking at is the New Kingdom. We have the Egyptians based at certain areas, and it really depends on where where the people who united Egypt were from, and all those sorts of things, and other factors as well. So just remember that Lower Egypt is to the north, and Upper Egypt is to the south. What we have also, and the period we're looking at is the focus is here, which is where most of the events sort of take place in Egypt. We have Abydos, which we'll mention briefly. Thebes is the capital at the time. We have temples at Luxor and a major temple complex at Karnak, as well as Deir el-Bahari, which is Hatshepsut's mortuary temple. That's the place of her mortuary temple. So that's kind of the focus of where we're at for Hatshepsut. These things here that we call cataracts, these are rapids. Essentially they're like rapids and waterfalls, and we've got three of those down here, and then there's another one further to the south as well. These cataracts were sort of geographical boundaries in ancient Egyptian times because they prevented ships from being sailed easily. You could pass through the cataracts, but it was quite difficult. And we'll talk about the extent to which Hatshepsut moved down past those cataracts over time as well. So that's a little bit of an overview. You've got the Red Sea over to the right, but the river here, it flows to the north, and it's most significant for the Egyptians because it was the lifeblood of their society. So when we have a look at it, we're going to look at the Nile River, which is the most important feature. Without the Nile River, the Egyptian society wouldn't have been what it was. We don't know exactly. Essentially, it flows north from Uganda to the Mediterranean Sea. There's two sort of Nile rivers in the lower part of Africa, or the upper part of Africa, the White Nile and the Blue Nile, and they kind of come together and create the Nile River, and they flow out to the Mediterranean Sea. What we need to understand, I suppose, is that the river flooded annually, or mostly annually, and what that flooding did was it created sort of the soil or the silt from that flooding, which would stretch kilometres on either side of the river. It really varied depending on where you were. It would deposit all this soil and silt, and that soil and silt would create really good fertile farming land for the Egyptians on either side of the Nile River. So even though it's in the middle of a desert, it was very, very agriculturally rich. And when we've looked at Rome, you can see why Egypt was the breadbasket of Rome. So what we have is an area which is broken up into two colours, really. The black land, which the Egyptians called Kumt or Kumut. We don't really know that. We don't really know how vowels were pronounced in Egypt, which was really fertile. And we have the red land, which was kind of seen as a wasteland and a dangerous place. So that's all. The red land's all the desert around, and the black land is where the Egyptians sort of spent all their time. So they didn't really have habitation outside the black land. The black land is the fertile strip right down the middle. On each side we've got sandstone and limestone cliffs, and they keep most of that valley of the Egyptians, that fertile strip, they're hemmed in by those cliffs. So it was kind of a natural protection for the Egyptians, and that's what kept them quite isolated for a long period of time. So this is a satellite image. It's not a very good one, but what you can see here is a couple interesting features. You've got you can see the delta, and you can see how green that is up there, because you've got all this water flowing out to the north, and you can sort of see how the Nile snakes along and flows north up through here. So that gives you a bit of an idea of what the land looks like, but you can see it is quite red and quite sandy all the way through, but you can see that the river itself is dark, and most of what you can see there isn't actually the river. It's the left and the right hand side of the river where the dirt has been deposited dirt has been deposited black. This is a far better picture, and this is what the river actually looks like. So this is the river flowing along. You can see it here. It's quite dark. All this stuff is where it's flooded. So this is where the river has flooded, and you can see that's far more fertile. Now, these satellite pictures have been taken since the installation of the Aswan Dam, which stops the Nile from flooding. So it would have been probably far more fertile during the time of the Egyptians as well, which is important to remember. But you can see over this side just how red and desert it is. There's not much to it at all. So the flooding of Egypt was called the inundation, which just means flooding. That's just what it means. And it was the most important event for the Egyptians, and in fact if it didn't happen, it could threaten their livelihood and their ability to exist, because they relied on the grain that they could grow from that flooding, and that allowed them to irrigate the land as well as provide that really rich soil all along the valley. And that soil was travelled all the way down through Africa. So really, really good minerals in that soil. And the other thing we have to think about is that Egypt was divided into 3 seasons, which were created by the inundation. So they didn't have the typical 4 seasons that we know. They had flood, which was called Akhet. They had the sowing season after the flood, where you'd plant the seeds, which was called Peret. And you had the harvest season, which is called Shem. And those are the 3 seasons. So it's either when the Nile's in flood, you can't do any agricultural work. And the rest of the time you're either planting or you're harvesting. So that's how they broke up the land. So in terms of the desert that we can see here too, really sandy. It didn't really promote a whole heap of trade, but there were some trade links with other areas. But because of because of the nature of the desert, they were reasonably isolated, the Egyptians. They were more prone to travelling north and south rather than from sort of east to west. So in terms of Egypt's neighbours, we do have a few groups. They did have, in terms of neighbours, there was trading expeditions, there was expeditions to go and get stock, cattle and those sorts of things, and also slaves, and there were also military campaigns that we have at the time as well. So the deserts to the east and to the west and the sea to the north were really good natural barriers for the Egyptians. But what the Egyptians called, they had a name that they called their foreign neighbours, and they called them the 9 bows. And we have a variety of different neighbours. So we've got the southern lands, we have groups in the southern lands, we have Libya to the west, the Mediterranean people to the north. There's a variety of different sort of groups that we can look at for Egypt when we're looking at their group. The Mitanni to the north, groups in Syria that they traded with, in the Sinai, in Palestine, and down to the land of Punt, which is to the south as well. So there were a variety of neighbours that they had, we don't need to know that much about them as an overview. We'll look at them more specifically when we look at Hatshepsut's trading expeditions and her military campaigns. In terms of resources that the Egyptians had, remember that we've got that fertile river, which was really the best thing in terms of developing agriculture, and that allowed them to irrigate their crops. So we better talk about what sort of crops they had. They grew barley and ema wheat, which was just a type of wheat that they grew, a lot of which was exported to Rome, which helped them make bread and beer. Flax, which is the flax plant is used to make linen, to make cloth. Vegetables, fruits, herbs and small trees as well. We have to remember that most of the wood in Egypt didn't come from Egypt. They had to import a lot of wood because it's a desert. So they could grow small trees, but generally they grew crops, not a whole heap of trees. They also have a lot of animal and bird life, fish, domestic pigs, sheep, goats, cattle, geese, those sorts of things, pretty much what you'd expect from a farming area as well. And we also have the Nile was used for trading north and south between these different groups of people. In terms of building materials, the main sort of building materials were mud brick, because they would use the mud from the Nile River. So even palaces at this time were made from mud brick. It was the most versatile type of building material for the Egyptians, because you've got good quality soil to make the mud bricks, and you've got the sun, which is pretty good at making the mud bricks and baking them. And they also used the cliffs, the limestone and sandstone and those sorts of things as well. Granite, they quarried those stones from down to the south and used them for buildings like temples and for tombs and those sorts of things as well. So it wasn't all mud brick. They also used a lot of sandstone stuff, which is why we have so much of that left over today for us to look at. In other building materials we had we had reeds for papyrus, the papyrus plant. They'd use those reeds that grew in the Nile River, and they would bash them in a cross-hatched formation. That's what they would use for papyrus, which they would write on. They also had some woods and reeds that they used for boats and for sandals and other sorts of things. The desert provided some semi-precious stones like amethysts, and gold and copper, basalt, alabaster, some other important elements as well. The cliffs were used, as you can see here. This is the mortuary temple, and you can see the cliffs there. This is the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, which is called Deir el-Bahari, and that was quarried into the base of the cliffs. And these cliffs were used for burials and temples and those sorts of things as well. There were wild animals that were hunted as well. Hippopotamuses and crocodiles and those sorts of things too. There was trading with other places like Lebanon for wood, which was important as well, and there was some cultural exchange with places like Crete. Okay, so I'm going to go through the structure of and the overview of the 18th dynasty, and this is going to be a little bit long, and I apologise for that. I promise I'll try and make it as quick as I can. So to understand how Egypt sort of fits in, we need to fit in, or where the New Kingdom fits in Egypt, we need to look at how it's structured. So the first thing we have are two terms we need to learn. We have kingdom, and we have dynasty. So a kingdom is where you have Upper and Lower Egypt. If you remember, they're like two states almost in the one country, but we would never refer to them as that. You've got Lower Egypt, which is up to the north, and Upper Egypt, which is down to the south. So a kingdom is when they're united. Okay, it becomes a kingdom of two states kind of united together. So that's what a kingdom is. A dynasty is where you've got continued rule from the one family. So it's kind of like a monarchy. And that's what a dynasty is where you've got continual rule. So when a new person would come along and maybe kill or overtake a previous ruler, then that dynasty would end and a new dynasty would begin. And that dynasty might have 10 family members in a row rule, it might have 2. But these changed over time, and what you find in Egypt is we end up with 30 dynasties in Egypt over time. So 30 ruling families over a long, long period of time who rule and then are ousted and kicked out and all those sorts of things. So they're the two terms we need to look at. The first one is is kingdom, and the other one is dynasty. Okay, so moving along, the next thing we're going to look at is the structure. And we have the first period that we look at is called the pre-dynastic period. So that pre-dynastic period is where we don't really have any dynasties at all, and it's certainly not any kingdoms in this period. After that we have the Thinite period. Now that Thinite period, we start with dynasties. So we have dynasties 1 to 3. And so what's happened is that dynasty 1 starts over a few successions. We end up with a new ruler come in, so that becomes dynasty 2, and then eventually they're kicked out and we become dynasty 3, and that's kind of how it works. Oh, sorry, that Thinite period only had 2 dynasties in it, my mistake. So after that Thinite period, we actually move into the Old Kingdom. So it's called the Old Kingdom. It's called the Old Kingdom because it is the oldest one for us looking back. And what we have there is where we have Lower and Upper Egypt is united in that Old Kingdom period. So they're actually united together, and that lasts from Dynasty 3 to Dynasty 6 that goes from. What ends up happening then, the Old Kingdom finishes because Upper and Lower Egypt are no longer united. They've split, and we have the first intermediate period. So in that first intermediate period we have Dynasty 7 to 11. So what that means is, if we think about our model here with the Lower and our Upper Egypt, it doesn't mean that they're sort of, it's all happening in the Lower or all happening in the Upper. It means that it's kind of happening concurrently. So we might have Dynasty 7's here and Dynasty 8's here, and then someone will overthrow Dynasty 7 and we'll end up with Dynasty 9. And then someone will overthrow Dynasty 9 and we'll end up with Dynasty 10. And then someone will overthrow Dynasty 8 and we'll end up with Dynasty 11, if that makes sense. So that's how it kind of works. That kind of sort of fits together, if that makes sense. And obviously Dynasty 11 continues because that starts the new dynasty, which becomes the Middle Kingdom. So again, we have the unification. Whoever was running Dynasty 10 is kicked out, and whoever's running Dynasty 11 has become the new ruler of both Upper and Lower Egypt. So after that Middle Kingdom, what we see is the second intermediate period, where we have again Upper and Lower Egypt, who were united, have been split again. So that's the second intermediate period. And with that we have a whole bunch more dynasties. We have Dynasty 14, which continued on from the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom had dynasties 11 to 14. And the second intermediate period, Dynasty 14, continued, but separately. And we have Dynasty 15 and 16 are a group called the Hyksos. And they were an invading group. They weren't from Egypt. They invaded Egypt and took over. We don't know, or we've got a fair idea where they came from, but they took over Egypt at this time, and they started their own dynasty. And then we have another dynasty who rises up, and their base was in Thebes, and that was Dynasty 17. So we have Dynasty 14 continues, 15 and 16 are this group called the Hyksos, and Dynasty 17 rises up from a place called Thebes. And it's this Dynasty 17 here, it's that dynasty that begins the new kingdom. So after this second intermediate period, this dynasty here, Dynasty 17, manages to unite Lower and Upper Egypt. They manage to defeat and kick out these Hyksos, which ends those dynasties. That dynasty is already finished. They've united Upper and Lower Egypt. It becomes Dynasty 17, which moves on to Dynasty 18 when we move into this new Kingdom period, which is where we have Dynasty 18, which stems from this Dynasty 17 over here. Dynasty 18 is the period that we look at, and we look at where Hatshepsut fits into that. We have King Ahmose, whose brother Kamose was in this 17th dynasty, and Ahmose is there. We have another king, Amenhotep the first, and then we have Thutmose the first, who is Hatshepsut's father. Then we have Thutmose the second, which is Hatshepsut's brother and also her husband, because they did that. And then we have Hatshepsut, and that's where she fits into that whole New Kingdom sort of period. That's our overview of this period. In the iBook, you do need to read through these people and what happened. That's a real brief overview. I won't speak forever, otherwise it will take too long. But we have some other kings that we need to look at in the 17th dynasty. We have Seqenenre Tao II in the 17th dynasty, and what he did. He has arguments with Hyksos king and all those sorts of things. We have his successor, Kamose, who has an expedition, and he starts fighting against the Hyksos. So they start fighting back against the Hyksos. Then we have the first king, which is Ahmose of the New Kingdom, and he defeats the Hyksos and essentially gets rid of them. And so he reunifies Upper and Lower Egypt. And they learned a lot from the Hyksos. They took the chariot from the Hyksos, and they took the kepresh, which is a type of sword from the Hyksos. The Hyksos had defeated the Egyptians with them. They adapted that technology and then used it against them and took over them as well. And then after Ahmose, we move into the 18th dynasty proper, where we have Amenhotep, who started some of the traditions that we see Hatshepsut follow. Then Thutmose I, Thutmose II, Thutmose III, who is Hatshepsut's sort of nephew. And then we have some other kings after that as well. So that's a bit of an overview. I know it's probably a lot to take in, but just remember the intermediate periods are where it's been split into Upper and Lower Egypt being ruled separately. A kingdom is where it's united, and a dynasty is a continual rule over time. And the dynasty we're looking at is Dynasty 18, which is right at the start of the New Kingdom Egypt, which is the final kingdom in the Egyptian sort of time frame.